It's Miss Sarah. We're going to read the last two chapters of Owen Foote's Super Spy. Yesterday we left off with Owen and his friends spying on the school principal, and they fell out of their hiding spot, and the principal caught them and has asked them to return back to his house on Saturday. So let's see how this book ends, shall we? Here we go. Chapter 6, Taking It Like a Man. "It's going to be a long week," said Mr. Foote. "A very long week," said Lydia, "with a terrible ending." Mrs. Foote rested her hand on Lydia's arm. "I don't think Owen needs to hear that, Lydia." Owen moved a piece of lettuce over to cover up his potato salad. The last thing he wanted right now was food. Now that he was home, now that he had watched his parents' reaction, the heady feeling of being a comrade in arms with Joseph had disappeared. He had told them what happened, but not how he had felt. How he had felt was not something he wanted to say out loud. The humiliation of lying there on the ground with Mr. Mahoney looking down at him. The shame of standing there with his mouth hanging open with nothing to say. Of not having the guts to tell the truth. Those kinds of things were very impossible to talk about. When he got to the part about Joseph, Lydia thumped the table with her fist and said, "Good old Joseph!" "That was a brave thing for him to do," said Mr. Foote. "I know," said Owen. "Mr. Mahoney knew there were others. He could hear them running away, but I didn't tell them who. He said that they could come back with Joseph and me on Saturday." "Will they?" said his mom. "Anthony said he wouldn't." "What about Ben?" "I don't know," Owen shrugged. "Probably not." "Mr. Mahoney, of all people," said Lydia. She shook her head in amazement. "That's a wacky idea, even for you, Owen." "It certainly has gotten very complicated," said their dad. "But Owen can handle it." "You don't think we could call?" His mom looked hopefully at his dad. "No," Owen and his dad said at the same time. "Dad is right," Owen said. "Joseph and me can handle it." Owen's mom didn't bother to correct his grammar. "What do you think he'll do?" said Lydia. "Mr. Mahoney is a very fair man," Mrs. Foote said firmly. "I'm sure it will be something reasonable." Owen and Lydia looked at each other. "Maybe Mom's right," said Owen's face. "Not a chance," answered Lydia's face. Owen was almost glad when he woke up on Saturday morning. Between Anthony bugging him and his trying to avoid Mr. Mahoney in the halls, it had been the longest week of his life. He didn't think he'd slept a wink all week. Every time he closed his eyes, visions of Saturday morning ran through his brain like a video. He and Joseph would walk up to Mr. Mahoney's house. They'd knock on Mr. Mahoney's door. Mr. Mahoney would open it and say, Owen's eyes popped open every time. He couldn't begin to imagine what Mr. Mahoney was going to say or do. Standing at the front door with his mom, Owen felt like a prisoner taking his last lonely stroll. "If you're not home in 2 days, we'll send out the police," Lydia called cheerfully from the study. "Lydia, that's mean." Mrs. Foote looked at Owen with a worried face. "You look tired, sweetie. Are you feeling all right?" "For heaven's sake," Lydia shouted. "He's practically going to jail. How do you expect him to look?" Owen's mom came outside, closing the door behind them, and put her arms around his shoulders. "Are you sure you don't want me to drive you?" "No, thanks." Owen put on his helmet and walked over to his bike. "Joseph's riding his bike, too. We want to be able to make a fast getaway." "I'm sure everything will be fine," said his mom. "I'll have a nice lunch waiting when you get home." "Okay," Owen said. "Bye." He kicked up his kickstand and pushed off without looking back. He knew his mom was standing there watching him. When he turned onto Chesterfield Road, Joseph was riding toward him from the other direction. They met halfway. "Hi," Joseph said. "Hi." They looked at each other for a minute, then Owen shrugged. "I guess we better get going." "Yeah, I don't want to add tardiness on top of everything else." They rode in silence until they neared Mr. Mahoney's road. Someone was sitting on the grass on the corner. It was Ben. He stood up when he saw them coming. "What are you doing here?" said Owen, amazed. I'm coming with you, said Ben. He picked his bike up off the grass. Why? Said Joseph. I was there, wasn't I? Yeah, but he doesn't know. We let you think you did, to punish you, said Owen. Well, not you so much. Anthony. Mr. Mahoney doesn't know anything. Well, I do. Ben jutted out his jaw. What kind of chicken do you think I am? There was a heavy silence between them. Then Owen said, Fried. Ben only snorted, but Owen could see he thought it was a good answer. They hopped on their bikes and started to ride. Owen almost felt good as he pedaled. It was the three of them, side by side in the middle of the road, the cavalry, riding to face the enemy. His bubble burst when Mrs. Mahoney answered the door. Mr. Mahoney's down in the basement, boys. She smiled at them encouragingly. Go right down. They filed past her with Owen in the lead. The basement? He thought. Why was he waiting in the basement? Why couldn't they do this outside, so the whole world could see? He put his hand on the basement door. This one? He said doubtfully. He hoped Mrs. Mahoney would hear the worry in his voice. Maybe she'd come with them. But all she did was nod. That's right. Owen opened the door. Mr. Mahoney was standing at the bottom of the stairs. Come on down, boys, he said in a hearty voice. They walked down slowly, like zombies in a chain gang. Nice to see you, Ben, said Mr. Mahoney. At least it wasn't a padded cell, the way Lydia had almost convinced Owen it was going to be. It was a normal playroom. There was a striped rug on the floor and a huge couch with a coffee table in front of it. There were a few beanbag chairs, too, and a TV in one corner. A ping-pong table was pushed against one wall. Another wall was filled with bookshelves. Make yourselves at home, said Mr. Mahoney. He waved them toward the couch. Go on, take a seat. Owen perched on the edge of the cushion with Ben on one side and Joseph on the other. He had to force himself not to clutch Joseph's hand. Well, said Mr. Mahoney. He paced slowly back and forth in front of them, taking his time. How was your week? None of them said anything for a minute. Then Owen said, Long. Excuse me, Owen? Mr. Mahoney leaned toward him. I didn't hear you. Owen looked up. Long, he said again. Mr. Mahoney nodded. And how did you feel? Owen stared up at him. He couldn't tell what Mr. Mahoney was after, but he was tired of the suspense. Terrible, he said with feeling. I tossed and turned every night. Ah, Mr. Mahoney nodded again as if it was what he had expected Owen to say. Joseph? Joseph looked up. My stomach didn't feel so good. Mr. Mahoney nodded again and took a step sideways to stand in front of Ben. And you, Ben? Ben was staring down at his hands clenched in his lap. For a minute, Owen thought he wasn't going to answer. But then he did. I was worried, he said. His voice was muffled. Worried about what? Asked Mr. Mahoney. Then there was a pause. Then, that I was a chicken. A chicken? Asked Mr. Mahoney. Yeah, Ben finally looked up at him. For running. The silence in the room was deafening. Well, I think you can put your mind to rest on that score, Ben, said Mr. Mahoney. You're definitely not a chicken. Coming back here with Owen and Joseph today wasn't an easy thing to do, was it? Ben shook his head. Brave things usually aren't, said Mr. Mahoney. He looked at Owen. And you, Owen? Owen sat up straight. He made himself meet Mr. Mahoney's eyes. You could have told me who the other boys were, but you didn't. I respect that, and you didn't try to make any excuses for yourself. I respect that, too. Owen's heart was beating against his chest so hard he was sure they could all hear it. Joseph was last. As for you, Joseph, you came back to support a friend, said Mr. Mahoney. That was a very brave thing to do. I bet Owen will never forget it. I won't, said Owen. They were all quiet. It felt good having Mr. Mahoney say nice things about them and not yelling, but there was still one thing on their minds, their punishment. Well, I guess there's only one thing left to do, said Mr. Mahoney. He went over to the ping pong table and picked up 3 paddles. He came back and held them out to the boys. Pick your paddle, he said. Chapter 7. Trapped again. He hit you? Said Lydia. Are you joking? Owen tossed his bike helmet into the basket by the kitchen door. We played ping pong. Ping pong? This shocked her even more. That's what he did to punish you? He made you play ping pong? Mm-hmm. And he gave us soda and chips. Owen plunked down in the chair. It was fun. You spy on the guy, and he throws you a party? Now Lydia was mad. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard of. I think what Mr. Mahoney did to punish them, Lydia, was to make them wait a week, said Mr. Foote. He looked up from the cutting board where he was chopping onions for stir-fry. I think Owen would tell you that was quite a bit of punishment. Big deal, Lydia said rudely. Didn't he say anything about spying on him? She asked Owen. Not in those words. What do you mean, not in words? How else could he do it? I must say, I have gained even more respect for Marty Mahoney, said their mom. She came out of the pantry and put the wok on the stove. When Mr. Foote did the chopping, she did the cooking. I think the way he handled this was wonderful. I don't get it. Lydia was looking from one parent to the other in disbelief. Owen does a really dumb thing, and when he gets caught, he gets to play ping pong and drink soda, and the 2 of you think it's wonderful? Do you mind if I go upstairs? Owen said. Go ahead, said his mom. I bet you're tired. I'm exhausted. What are you going to do the next time he does something dumb? Lydia said as he left the room. Take him to Bermuda? Owen dragged himself up the stairs and into the room. He fell across his bed and closed his eyes. He couldn't even begin to explain to Lydia about how much he'd learned from Mr. Mahoney's brand of punishment. He had gone to the Mahoneys feeling so terrified, and then he left feeling great. Mr. Mahoney hadn't said a word about the spying, because this whole thing hadn't really been about the spying, Owen realized. It had been about facing up to things. Either you did, or you didn't. If you did, then whatever it was you had done was over. You could move on. If you didn't, it would never be over. It would always be there, nagging at you. It wasn't the kind of thing Owen could put into words, especially not to Lydia. He knew it would come out sounding dumb. But it wasn't dumb. It was right. Owen got up and looked at his face in the mirror. Did he look a little more mature? Or was that dirt? He rubbed at the space between his eyes. Okay, so he looked the same, but he felt more mature. And all of a sudden, he wasn't the least bit tired. Maybe he'd make his salamanders a new environment this afternoon, he thought, bending down to peer into his aquarium. Go into the woods and find some fresh moss. Maybe get a bigger stick for them to climb on. Owen opened his drawer and rummaged around for a Swiss Army knife. He'd asked his mom if Joseph and Ben could come over tomorrow. Maybe they could start a new club, the Men of Steel Club. Instead of spying, they could make up a new secret code and send important messages back and forth. They wouldn't need walkie-talkies for that. Ben said his dad had taken them away from him anyway. Owen shoved his knife in his back pocket and put on his fishing vest. It was funny, the way things had changed because of this. He had started off trusting Anthony and not trusting Ben. Now, it was the other way around. One last chocolate chip cookie. Owen lifted up the lid to the cookie jar as noiselessly as he could and put it on the counter. So what if he had already brushed his teeth and was supposed to be in bed? Which was worse, sleeping with chocolate-covered teeth or going to bed without one final cookie? He had his hand on a big fat one when he heard them coming. Owen didn't even think. He dropped the cookie, ducked into the broom closet, and shut the door. He barely caught the mop before it hit the floor. He heard his mom and dad come into the kitchen. Decaf coffee or tea, said his mom. Someone turned on the water. Tea would be great. Owen heard the click of the gas stove being turned on, then a pot being put on the burner. He slid down into a crouched position against the wall. He couldn't believe it. Here he was, Mr. Maturity, trapped again. It served him right that his parents were talking about some really boring stuff, like what some student of his dad's had said at college, and when the last time was they had had the septic tank cleaned. Then he heard his mom say his name. I think Owen learned a lot from this whole experience, don't you? Oh, yes, I'm sure he'll never spy on anyone again. Oh, I know you're right. Their voices sounded stiff and loud, as though they were actors reading their lines for the first time. Maybe we should buy him a present as a reward, said his mom. Owen's ears perked up. I think you're right, said his dad. I was thinking along the lines of a dirt bike. A dirt bike? Owen shot up so fast, his head crashed into the bottom shelf. He covered it with his hands and his mom's gardening boots, a plastic bucket, a basket of rags, and about 20 empty coffee cans that fell around him. There was a deafening silence in the kitchen. Owen sat there astounded. And then he rallied. Nope. There was no way he was going to sit here once again waiting to be discovered. He was going to meet this heads on with dignity. He scrambled to his feet and flung open the broom closet door. He saw the chocolate chip cookie in pieces on the floor and the lid of the cookie jar on the counter. Hi, he said, smiling brightly. I couldn't help but overhear. Did someone say something about a dirt bike? The end. Owen Foote, Super Spy. And now, in order for you to get your Owen Foote Super Spy pin for your lanyard, you need to do the following. I need you to email a secret word to summerreading@bradleylibrary.org. Okay? This way I know you read all the chapters with me. Are you ready for the secret word? The secret word that I need you to email to me at summerreading@bradleylibrary.org is underwear. Yep, underwear. You need to email me that secret word. See you soon.